So today we're actually back at Brad's and we get to work on the VR4 and we're going to be assembling and measuring the bottom end. And we're actually doing the Plastigauge method today. We've got all new bearings, piston rings, pretty much everything to put it back together. So it's been a long time coming. It's time to get to it. So right off the rip, we're actually already got the crank and everything out, bearings in, and we're going to be installing the crank and checking the squish with Plastigauge. When you're checking clearances with Plastigauge, both of your surfaces, bearing and journal, has to be perfectly clean. If you have any oil, it'll cause a little bit of film and you won't get an accurate reading because it'll be making up that gap. Do not spin this with no lubrication. You're strictly torquing your girdle down so you can crush your bearings to the right size via the torque spec, and then you're measuring the crush there. You can see I already goofed up, and I actually have to move the crank because on you're measuring the very top, because that's where you measure your bearing clearance. You don't want to measure it any sort of off. It has to be exactly on top, and this oil feed right here is directly on top, so we have to move the crank. Now if you see directly from top, there are no main oil feeds directly on top. Now you'll take green Plastigauge. What you're going to do is you're going to cut this little hair of plastic the same width as your journal. When you torque your girdle down, it'll squish this and you will read your squish. You'll compare it, which we'll show you in a second, and that's how you read your Plastigauge. Now let's chop it into pieces. Once you cut it, lay it on top and lay it straight across. Don't put it on the edge of the journal, put it directly in the middle so you can get the full squish. Just like that, it's directly straight and right on top of the journal. So now let's do the rest. Plastigauge on each 4 main journal. Now let's grab the girdle and place it on and torque it down to spec. The arrow points to the front. Make sure them bearings are clean. Don't be like me and just pick it up by the bearing. And just evenly tighten them all down until you get them snug with your fingers. And then I believe there's 3 different sequences to torque it. So the torque spec here for your mains are 67 foot-pounds. Mine only goes to 25, so that's where we will begin. Start in the middle. We're gonna go like this. Doing the spiral method. Now we're gonna up to 50. Now we'll take the step up to 67 and finish it off. Once you got them all torqued up, just loosen them back up and take them all off. I like to break them loose in the same order, do about a full turn, and then just take them the rest of the way out. It's always better to do it evenly to ensure you do it right than to mess it up doing something so simple. Quarter turn a piece to crack them loose. Once you take your girdle off and you can see the little bit of squish from the Plastigauge, you take your gauge and you line it up and see what it is closest to. Right here it says 3 thousandths is skinny and the 2 thousandths is kind of wide, so it's like right in between there. So that tells us that's at about maybe 25 hundredths. There's 25 thousandths, sorry. If not, right on 2. So let's consult the factory service manual and see if we were within spec. It looks pretty even across the board here as well. They're all right on 2, if not just a little under. That just means we have a little bit more oil clearance, which is not a terrible thing. I don't know how well you guys can see here on the phone. It says right here, the standard value is 2 thousandths, but the limit is 4 thousandths. So that means we're plenty within spec. So now that we know we're within spec, we actually have to go back and we have to clean all of this plastic off of not only these journals, but these bearings over here as well. You want to clean it off so it does not interfere with your bearing clearance and cause you to spin a bearing or anything crazy. Once you got it all blown and clean out, just wipe up all your surfaces one more time. Now we just went and picked up some assembly lube. Be a little liberal with it. You're going to go back and smudge it with your fingers. Just get it on the whole surface of the bearing. You just want to coat the whole thing. I've got, I think it's Permatex stuff at home, but you gotta love that Lucas oil. Come on now. We're all lubed up. All of our contact surfaces are now oiled. Also want to make sure your crank is clean and free of any debris before you install. And once you set it down, give it a nice little spin. Everything's all good. I'm actually going to do the same thing to our bearings here on our main girdle. Now that your girdle's on, go ahead and do the same thing. Just hand tighten it, get it straight, walk it all the way down, and you want to get it hand tight before you walk it down so you know it's on straight. If not, you could damage the mating surface down here between your block and your girdle. Since we got them all snugged up, we're going to do the same amount of turns on each. Do about a half turn at a time. Just snug the girdle down. And we're getting them all snug before we bring the torque wrench out. Now for our last set of 67. Don't forget to go back and just check your torque 1 second time. Peace of mind. So a rookie mistake here. I forgot on these motors the thrust bearing is actually separate from the rear main bearing. Like this. This is the old thrust bearing. This actually sits back here, acts as a bearing for the thrust of the crank. As you can see, it actually slides back and forth. So we actually need to take this back off, and we need to limit that by installing new thrust bearings. On the Z32s, it's built into the rear main bearing cap, so I didn't think of it here, obviously. This out the last time.
Yeah, I marked them.
So now we install the thrust washer, and I believe your oil side will be on this little groove side will be on the inside. Just kidding, they'll be on the outside. And you'll have both keyed one of these, one will go on each side, one on the block and one on the girdle side. You probably can't see too well, but right there on the thrust washer you can see outwards facing are these little oil lines or divots for the oil. We're actually going to throw a little bit of lube on it so they actually stick and stay. But you don't want these falling off while you're trying to install everything. Now that they're in place here, we need to place them in the girdle. And then we can place the girdle without them falling out because they're coated with oil. Now that the thrust washer is installed, let's install the crank again and then the girdle. Finger tight, and then in 3 stages, torque it down. Don't forget to recheck your torque. Because the RB25 I bought, when I went to tear it down, one side was significantly less tight than the other. And that's why you guys have not seen anything RB related. Now that feels nice. Feels better than it did, doesn't it? No crunch.
Nope.
Now we're on to piston related stuff. Don't forget your little secondary bolts here on the side. Should be 8 in total with these little L brackets. There'll be 4 of those. The torque spec on these bad boys is only 35 foot-pounds. That was our last secondary main bracket bolt. The crank is now in to stay. has no plans on coming back out anytime soon. Now that we got the crank in and all the bearings are sorted out, we're going to be working on ring gap next. Insert it, and then the way to get it flush, you'll actually take the piston for that cylinder and you will push it down in the bore until it's even about right here, which is the crown of the piston. You want it to be even across the bore, and you can go back if you can see that little gap right there. Now you're going to take a feeler gauge and you're going to measure that until you get to spec. And I'm going to check the factory service manual real quick and see where we're at. Here's the specs for our ring gap. Looks like our first one for 0.0118 to 0.0177. So that's a little bit. Let's see where we're at. Now we have a 0.08 or 0.008 and a 0.01. So this is the highest end of the spec by 3 thousandths. And it is just too snug to fit in there. So that tells me that we are within spec, but we are right towards the larger end, which is going to be perfect for a boosted application. You would much rather it be looser than you would tighter. Now that we're done checking the upper ring, let's move to the second ring. Now when you look at your second piston ring, there will actually be a sharper side. The rounded side you want to face towards the bottom. Well, I guess it is labeled top right here, because you want it to scrape and create compression on the way up. So you want the sharp edge to be up. Install this into the bore. And now let's grab our piston. Let's insert our piston and set our ring with the crown. So now we're going to test with the lowest or tightest feeler gauge. And we can actually fit them both in, so that's already a good sign. And we can fit. Alright, now let's move on to our oil control rings. Now to measure your oil control ring, we're going to go ahead and do the exact same thing as we have done with the others. Place it in the cylinder. Now we can visually tell with this one, there's slightly a bit more ring gap, and you actually want more gap down here for your oil scraper rings. Your spec's pretty broad, from a 0.0079 to 0.0236, so there's plenty of room to play here. Safe to say we're within spec though. Right here is our max limit, and we are within spec. Cannot fit it. Let's go ahead and assemble, or at least put the rings on the piston, and we'll see about dropping the piston down in the cylinder. So if you look right here, this will tell you how you want to orient your rings. Up here is your number 1 ring, and you want this point is pointing towards the front of the engine. So you want your number 1 at about the 130 mark. Well, you get the gist. You want to match up your second ring gap and the spacer that goes in between both your oil control rings. This one, those will have the same end. Your lower side rail is your oil scraper. So you'll have one way and the other one will be completely opposite. The same for your compression rings. One will be completely opposite while completely offset from your lower side rings. So here's the front side. That means the gap for our first oil ring is actually going to be down here towards this corner. Install your oil ring expander, and your gap for that will go here. It'll go about a quarter of the way around the piston. So you'll actually want to put your expander in first, because it actually has little like locators to allow your oil rings to go into place. See there, it actually slid in with the oil control ring in place. Lower oil scraper this side, oil expander ring here. Then we have our upper oil control. We have our second compression ring and then our first compression ring over here. Everything should be at least where it needs to be in the cylinder. Now installing it is going to be a whole different animal. Now you want to take some 10W30 or heavier oil, and you want to coat down your cylinder and all of your piston. Be very liberal with it and coat it up. Smear it all around. Make sure you get your skirt all coated, and then go back and do the same thing with the cylinder walls. Well, we thought we were going to be able to do it without a piston ring compressor. I don't think we are. So we're going to see if we can snag one and hopefully move on. We now got this sharp style of ring compressor. So we just tighten it all down with the Allen wrench, and it should just about be ready to go. Once all your rings are oriented correctly and you got your piston rings all compressed, center your piston in the piston ring compressor and ensure all your rings are equally as tight. Now you should be able to just push down on the piston and pop it into place. Give it a couple taps with the hammer. The piston is now in the cylinder. Now we need to flip it over and guide the connecting rod onto the crank so we can measure it with some Plastigauge. Let's grab the rod, angle it to where it's not going to come in contact with the journal, and then push up on your piston. And here you also want to make sure your journal and your bearing is dry, because yes, we are checking bearing clearance now. Just like that. We actually need to back it off slightly and turn the crank this way so we can actually get the rod cap on, and we want it to be able to put it straight on because we can't twist it once we put Plastigauge in. Let's take our piston and push it back down into the cylinder. And just like that, we've now seated onto the crank journal. Just cut our Plastigauge. Now let's place it on the journal. Now that it's straight on the journal, take your rod cap and place it on. Make sure it's dry and clean of debris and oil. Now on these, you want to actually match these indentations on the same side. Usually they are on opposing sides on the VG, at least from what I remember. Now we're going to put the cap on, and we're going to tighten it down just like we would if we were assembling it. And when you do tighten this down, even just snug it up, snug it evenly. You want to seat this as evenly as possible. And it's actually 37 foot-pounds for your connecting rod cap. Now for 37 foot-pounds. But before we hit the full torque, we're actually going to switch back and forth so we can still make sure that cap goes down evenly. Always check your torque and remove it evenly as possible too. Same way you put it on evenly. Pull our cap, and there's our reading. You really want to avoid the oil hole, but I obviously didn't think of that. Thankfully it wasn't right in the middle, and we actually got a good reading still. Consulting the Plastigauge. It's looking like we're at 2,000. It's right on the money. So let's clean this up and let's torque it back on because we are within spec. Clean up all that Plastigauge. Get yourself a nice clean surface. Now we're actually going to back this rod off. Let's smear our assembly lube around the crank journal. We can ensure that it's fully lubricated, and then we can seat our rod on the crank. Seated on the crank. Again, make sure you match your, I call them keyways, but your little indentations. And they go to the same side. Snug those back down. Just 37 foot-pounds for connecting rods. Don't forget to do it evenly as well. Look at that, we can actually spin it over by hand still. Now that's what you want to see. Now let's line up our next journal to where when we come straight up with our next cylinder, that we won't have to move it, and it'll be exactly where we need it, and we can put our cap directly on. Now that you guys get the gist, we're going to go ahead and do all the other 5 cylinders. It's going to take us a little bit of time, and we'll be back. There we've got all 6 cylinders installed. Everything's good to go with the exception of this cylinder here. So honestly, it's actually the next day. We were out here late last night. We were having a couple complications. We got 3 cylinders in last night. Found a problem with one of the rods, which actually wasn't a crazy big deal. The 4th cylinder, which we just pointed out, is more of a big deal than that. In this original block in the old crank, it actually spun 2 rods, and it would have been third and fourth cylinders here. In the midst of it spinning, this is kind of what's going on. So let me pull this bearing out. And you can just see how scratched and crappy that is. That's because it spun a bearing. Not only that, but our Plastigauge reading here was not within spec. It was about a 1/2 thousandths thicker than we wanted it to be, or 1/2 thousandths tighter than we wanted it to be. I'm gonna say something to Brad. He's not here right now. I'm just working by myself so we could get this done and get this video finished up. But I'm actually gonna tell him to get some oversized bearings, or maybe it's undersized. I need to fresh up on my terminology there. But pretty much we need bearings that are smaller than normal. But at the same time, what I'm thinking is we have these pistons over here and we would really like to use the rods because most of them are graded the same. But the problem we're having is, how do you get it out? I'm pretty sure you have to heat the piston and press out the pin. We don't have nothing like that here, so we're kind of like, what the heck? I brought snap ring pliers because on the Z32 they actually have little snap rings in there to hold the wrist pin in place. I assume that's what these had, but no, these need heated and pressed out. But before we fully wrap up, we're just going to flip this over and we're going to pull out the Plastigauge and we're going to show you guys kind of the problem. So here on the Plastigauge, we're looking for the second from the bottom. It's hard for you guys to read, but it's 3 thousandths, 2 thousandths, 1.5 thousandths, 1 thousandth on the top. This right here is definitely bigger than the 2 thousandths, and it's right on the 1.5 thousandths. So in theory, we need to get a little bit more oil clearance there, because if not, it's a little too tight and it's not going to last very long. We need to get that oil clearance above 2 thousandths at least, 3 thousandths at the most. You'll just have to raise your oil pressure depending which way you go. If you have more clearance, you need more oil pressure to fill the gap basically. If you have less clearance, you're going to have higher oil pressure. So far so good. I'm just going to leave that there for him to check out. The crank, you can see spins. It at least spun with that little bit of force. This is actually a very fun process for anyone else that's curious of doing the same type of work. Yeah, it's very expensive and painstaking, but man, I really feel that it's going to be rewarding once we finish up. So far so good. I'm happy with how everything's turning out. Been pretty smooth sailing so far, minus these very small hiccups. Next, when we come over here, we're probably going to be doing a head job over here on these heads. I've got a valve spring compressor and we're going to probably change out valve stem seals on all of these. We're going to clean that up, put new seals in it, get the cams seated. Probably lap some of the valves just to make sure that the seating surfaces are all even and, you know, not out of whack. Can't have a leaky head on a fresh engine. Yeah, that may be the next thing, especially considering if we have such little things left for this, we can get this done quickly, and then we really need to get the heads. Sorry for leaving you guys on the stand a lot of this video, and sorry for, you know, I don't know, maybe a little boring, but engine stuff is always fascinating to me. Next video, you guys can be expecting us to get our convertible out, engine in, transmission in, potentially started. We got to find out about our gas tank, but we may sort that all when we go out home today. We're gonna wrap up the video here, you guys. Hope you guys liked the video. If you did, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe down below so you can stay tuned for more videos and more content in the future. And until next time, peace.